CIA files reveal pole shift date you don't know. The moment everything starts to shift. High above the Arctic Circle, in the dead calm of winter 2019, data from European satellites began throwing errors. Tiny ones at first, the kind you could blame on solar interference. But within hours, entire clusters of orbiting instruments failed to sync with navigational references. In control rooms from Darmstadt to Houston, red lights started blinking in unison. Every one of them pointed to one problem. Magnetic north was no longer where it was supposed to be. And here's the strange part, scientists had seen it coming. But buried deep inside a newly declassified set of CIA files was something even stranger. A phrase repeated across multiple pages: terminal displacement of fields. It sounded technical, but agencies don't use a term like that unless they're talking about something that endangers national security. The voiceover almost writes itself. The CIA already knew this was coming. Now, to understand why that line matters, you've got to know that Earth's magnetic field is anything but stable. Throughout history, it's flipped, north becoming south, south becoming north. Sometimes it happens slowly, over thousands of years. Sometimes, according to geological records, it happens frighteningly fast. Beneath our feet, molten iron shifts inside the outer core like an ocean of metal. When those currents change, the magnetic lines we depend on, the very ones that guide compasses, protect satellites, and shield us from deadly radiation, begin to twist and drift. Normally, this process moves at a crawl, a few kilometers a year. But in the late 20th century, something changed. Magnetic north began racing across the Arctic at more than 50 kilometers per year. That's not just a geological curiosity, it's a navigational crisis. Air routes, GPS satellites, even underwater communication systems rely on stable magnetic coordinates. If they shift too quickly, synchronization collapses. And when you're a superpower living on Cold War nerves, that sounds a lot like a security threat. So while the public saw a technical curiosity, the intelligence world saw a potential weapon, or a warning. You can imagine the chatter inside the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. If Earth's field is about to flip, what happens to communications? To power grids? To missile guidance systems locked to magnetic reference points? The thought alone was enough to trigger internal eyes-only studies. Then came that classified phrase again, terminal displacement of fields. It appeared in connection with a small set of scientific reports the agency quietly obtained from civilian observatories and military tracking stations. Most of those reports never reached public journals. When Freedom of Information Act requests later uncovered fragments of those communications, the context was heavily redacted. But patterns remained. References to magnetic reorientation, loss of navigational coherence, and predictive models under compartmental clearance. Someone inside was looking far beyond ordinary geomagnetism. What no one outside those walls knew was that this interest wasn't new. The CIA had been collecting magnetic data since the early 1950s under different project names, some for submarine detection, some for atmospheric surveillance. But when researchers inside Langley started seeing the same acceleration geophysicists were quietly whispering about, the focus sharpened. And here's where the puzzle deepens. Among those declassified materials, hundreds of pages released between 2016 and 20,200, investigators found multiple cross-references between geomagnetic research and Cold War psychological programs. Why would an agency concerned with political subversion care about Earth's magnetic poles? Because if they believed the planet's stability, or human perception tied to it, could be influenced by shifting magnetic fields, the potential applications would be immense, maybe even existential. That's where our story starts to unravel decades of hidden research threads. Magnetic north wasn't just moving, it was being monitored, modeled, and by some accounts, predicted. And those predictions pointed to something most scientists considered impossible: a near-term pole shift significant enough to upset satellite integrity and global navigation. To find out how a natural planetary process became an intelligence obsession, we have to step back to the years when secrecy defined science, when the Cold War turned geophysics into espionage. Because behind those blinking satellite alarms lies an older story, one that begins in a time when every anomaly was a potential weapon. To see how all this connects, how magnetic drift turned into a CIA operation, we have to go back to the height of the Cold War. The magnetic mystery the public never heard about. It started quietly, long before anyone was watching magnetic north sprint across the Arctic. In the 1940s, geophysicists were still puzzling over wobbles in compass readings that didn't match their maps. At first, they assumed the instruments were faulty, until observatories in both hemispheres began logging the same drift. Just a few kilometers each decade, but in the same direction. That single anomaly launched decades of study. Post-war scientists, backed by military funding, expanded geomagnetic observatories across the globe. From Alaska to Antarctica, from Britain's Halley Bay to a series of secret outposts in Greenland and the Soviet Union. Officially, the goal was navigation safety. Unofficially, the goal was surveillance. Magnetometers could detect subtle distortions in the geomagnetic field caused by submarines or underground tests. The line between geophysics and intelligence started to blur. Meanwhile, ships at sea noticed their compasses deviating more and more from expected headings. Pilots flying near the pole had to periodically correct charts. What had once been a slow, stable drift began picking up speed. By the 1950s, a few researchers warned that the entire magnetic pole was accelerating towards Siberia. When they tried to publish findings through open channels, the papers quietly stalled in review. Others were simply marked classified. Behind the scenes, government geophysics programs multiplied. Files from the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, later merged into the Naval Oceanographic Office, show sudden funding surges tagged Strategic Orientation Control. That phrase sounds innocuous, but it referred to monitoring the magnetic framework used for missile guidance. During the Cold War, even the smallest variation in the field could throw intercontinental missiles off target by hundreds of miles. By the early 1960s, magnetometers had grown more sensitive, picking up fluctuations once thought impossible. Scientists discovered geomagnetic jerks, abrupt swings in field intensity that happened over months instead of millennia. Every time such a jerk was recorded, communication systems relying on Earth's magnetic environment would briefly lose calibration. The Air Force began installing independent observatories to cross-verify civilian results. The data set stayed secret for decades. Internal memos, some of which surfaced through declassification in the 1990s, show that certain analysts warned of potential global emergencies resulting from field instability. That phrasing hints at more than mere academic curiosity. A total reversal, they argued, could wipe out navigation satellites, disrupt power grids through induced currents, or expose the planet to increased solar radiation. Nobody knew exactly when or how quickly such an event might unfold, but the possibility entered national security discussions as early as 1962. Meanwhile, the global scientific community tried to maintain a careful distance from intelligence interests. Yet many leading geophysicists were dependents of government grants, meaning Langley or the Pentagon could quietly redirect research priorities. The establishment of restricted geomagnetic observatories, particularly around the Arctic Circle and in Canadian military zones, suggests that field data were compartmentalized long before the public realized anything was unusual. Across the Atlantic, the Soviets mirrored these efforts. Declassified KGB cables later referenced magnetic state anomalies of defensive concern. For both superpowers, the magnetic field became both a natural mystery and a tactical variable. If one side could forecast disturbances sooner, it might gain an edge in missile timing, satellite adjustment, even in predicting solar storms that could blind radar. Through the 1960s, as the nuclear arms race peaked, the idea of global geomagnetic defense emerged, a fusion of physics and espionage. U.S. scientists under funding from the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, tested magnetically hardened communication lines to withstand sudden fluctuations. At the same time, classified reports warned that the overall dipole strength of Earth's magnetic field was weakening at an unusual rate, about 5% per century, possibly faster. One memo from 1965, heavily redacted upon its 2017 declassification, mentioned projected disorientation cascades under polar field oscillation. It hinted that simultaneous failures could cripple early warning radar. Agencies preoccupied with nuclear retaliation scenarios suddenly faced a new theoretical threat, nature itself interfering with deterrence. In public journals, only fragments of this research appeared. When a British survey published data showing the pole's motion outpacing known models, reviewers added cautious language to downplay urgency. Privately, those same numbers were routed to Washington, D.C., for intelligence cross-analysis. The scientific and security worlds had effectively merged, one chasing truth, the other managing panic. By the end of the 1960s, as astronauts carried magnetometers aboard Apollo missions, the CIA maintained its own quiet archives of geomagnetic readings. Satellite data cross-checked with classified ground stations confirmed it. The drift was accelerating. And yet, almost no one outside classified circles discussed it as a crisis. To the public, magnetic north remained an abstract curiosity. To those behind closed doors, it represented a moving reference frame for every weapon, ship, and aircraft depending on orientation. A few insiders later admitted that concerns spread quickly through certain intelligence branches. A document from a Defense Science Board meeting in 1969 described non-gravitational instability forecasting as vital to national readiness. The phrase sounds oddly prophetic now. It meant they were attempting to predict when Earth's magnetic stability might buckle, long before satellites recorded their first glitch. So when the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence began indexing geomagnetic field research alongside nuclear and atmospheric surveillance in the early 1970s, it wasn't a coincidence. The groundwork had been laid over 3 decades of quiet measurement, secrecy, and suppressed warnings. The puzzle facing them wasn't whether the poles drifted. The data showed that clearly. The real question was why the pattern matched certain cyclical extinction models hinted at in geological cores. By then, what began as scattered scientific curiosity had evolved into a national priority, buried beneath layers of classification. Few outside observers knew magnetic drift had become an espionage subject, because every result, every variation, and every projection was absorbed into intelligence databases. And that's where the mystery deepened. The memos didn't stay in scientific hands for long. They began circulating within branches far removed from traditional geology, branches that looked at geomagnetic chaos not as a natural trend, but as a sign that something bigger, perhaps catastrophic, could be approaching. The CIA's curiosity turns into an obsession. When Cold War paranoia mixed with scientific uncertainty, even something as abstract as Earth's magnetism could feel like a weapon waiting to be discovered. Inside Langley's gray walls, in a climate of secrecy and constant comparison with the Soviets, geomagnetic readings weren't just data. They were potential intelligence assets. It began, as most intelligence threads did, with translation units. In the late 1940s, the agency started analyzing Soviet scientific publications for signs of breakthrough research. Most of it was routine: metallurgy, avionics, nuclear chemistry. But a series of obscure Soviet papers on geomagnetic anomalies under ionospheric excitation caught someone's attention. To analysts trained in coded language, those words hinted at controlled magnetic influence, maybe even weaponization. The memo went up the chain fast. Soon, CIA technical offices began cross-referencing these Soviet studies with US military observations. There was a pattern. Whenever either superpower tested high-altitude nuclear devices or strong electromagnetic equipment, magnetometer readings spiked. A natural field was behaving almost like it had feedback, subtle responses to human interference. If Earth's magnetosphere could be destabilized, even temporarily, what else might it reveal? That curiosity might have ended there, if not for a report brought in from external consultants contracted under the Office of Scientific Intelligence in the early 190s AXS. It described the recently written manuscript, The Adam and Eve Story, authored by John Thomas, an engineer and theologian who claimed geological cataclysms recurring every several thousand years were linked to abrupt magnetic displacement. The text described continents shifting, oceans washing over mountain ranges, and civilization restarting from scratch. Most saw it as far-fetched, but not everyone. An internal CIA routing slip attached to the document, later declassified but partially censored, listed it under Cataclysmic Cycle Research, Restricted Science. Somebody high enough believed it merited attention. The question was why? What possible use could a speculative catastrophe narrative have in intelligence work? The answer came from overlapping concerns: predictive defense. If mass displacement events had real geological bases, then understanding their cycles could determine continuity of government plans. Military readiness wasn't only about missiles. It needed assurance that any long-term planetary instability could be survived. Analysts flagged one section of the Thomas text where magnetic realignment preceded crustal displacement. Around the same time, CIA data from magnetic observatories showed our pole's drift was accelerating. It was probably coincidence, but Langley wasn't in the business of trusting coincidence. The phrase that began circulating internally was geophysical convergence. The fear was that physics and prophecy were describing the same thing through different languages. By 1965, specialized working groups within the agency were examining geomagnetism from angles far beyond normal science. They wanted cross-domain verification. If geological records suggested cyclical flips, could social mythologies or remote sensing models hint when they'd recur? Within months, analysts began drawing connections between ancient flood traditions and sudden environmental resets. A few even suggested ancient civilizations had survived prior pole shifts, storing knowledge in mythic form. That idea migrated from anthropology into national security briefings, where it took on a pragmatic tone. How do nations preserve continuity through global collapse? From that moment, curiosity became obsession. Teams under the Directorate of Science and Technology requested classified data from the U.S. Geological Survey and military satellites, arguing geomagnetic forecasting wasn't just research, it was defense strategy. Internal discussions revealed tension. Mainstream scientists urged caution, insisting the evidence didn't imply an imminent reversal, while intelligence officers framed even a 1% chance as justification for full study. One 1968 memorandum, still partially redacted, refers to an environmental predictive index prototype, essentially an attempt to use magnetic field data as an early warning signal. The term index suggests they were trying to quantify risk, to turn an incomprehensible planetary phenomenon into something measurable, maybe even controllable. Amid those papers appeared a curious note about correlating psychological forecasting with geomagnetic readings. At first glance, that seems nonsensical. Why link human perception to the planet's magnetism? But in the late 60s, the CIA's behavioral research divisions were already experimenting with consciousness studies, extrasensory perception, and what they called anomalous cognition. If the mind could detect or react to geomagnetic disturbance subconsciously, then maybe psychics, or remote viewers, could see planetary changes before instruments did. That idea would later merge directly into Project Stargate. But before the psychic era bloomed, Langley analysts had a simpler approach: recruit the physical scientists. They summoned external consultants, geophysicists from MIT, observatory staff from Boulder, plasma specialists from Los Alamos, and subjected them to restricted briefings where magnetic inversion contingency was presented as a legitimate risk scenario. Some balked. Others signed non-disclosure agreements and joined government atmospheric monitoring projects that quietly shared data with intelligence channels. During this period, open academic publications on geomagnetic drift nearly vanished. Scientists wondered why peer review had suddenly grown sticky. Behind closed doors, their drafts were being absorbed into classified repositories. What the public saw as gaps in data were, in fact, the footprints of what intelligence officers called containment redaction. The reasoning was simple. Uncontrolled discussion of potential pole shift timelines could spark public panic, undermine faith in stability, even affect financial markets tied to satellite infrastructure. By the early 1970s, the CIA's archives contained hundreds of magnetic models, correspondence from observatories worldwide, and cross-indexed geological catastrophe theories. A few analysts joked darkly that Earth's core had joined the list of national security concerns. Yet humor masked real anxiety. Memos reveal growing conviction that natural catastrophe was not beyond political consequence. If states knew beforehand that a physical upheaval was inevitable, their every move, stockpiling, closures, underground construction, could become self-fulfilling signs of collapse. Then something unusual happened. A senior reviewer from the Directorate of Intelligence appended a classified summary describing continuity imperatives under magnetic collapse parameters. The use of the word imperatives implied an operational framework, not merely curiosity but planning. Parallel to nuclear winter models, an entire shadow doctrine was forming around geomagnetic disruption. Still, doubts persisted. Some in the agency warned it was turning pseudoscience into policy. A counter-memo circulated in 1972 accused colleagues of conflating speculative cataclysm literature with field physics. It didn't matter. The believers had allies in upper management, and the budget continued flowing. Soon the line between investigation and faith blurred. Analysts began plotting possible trigger years by overlaying paleomagnetic data, patterns of magnetic field reversals extracted from ocean sediments, with solar cycles. Their predictive models consistently pointed to clusters in the mid-21st century. That convergence wasn't proof, but in intelligence culture, repeated correlation feels like destiny. By 1974, the obsession had official form under compartmental labels, so generic they passed unnoticed. Geodynamic stability projects, environmental continuity studies. Beneath those headings, the conversation shifted from if to when. A few of the more speculative officers started using the coded term, the cycle, to describe the recurring displacement that the Adam and Eve story had dramatized. From a dusty manuscript to a line item in classified budgets, the chain was complete. The CIA was no longer just observing magnetism, it was mapping humanity's odds against the planet's own heartbeat. Enter the psychic programs, Stargate and Gateway. It sounds improbable, almost cinematic, the CIA tasking psychics to see magnetic fields in their minds. But in the 197s, that's exactly the kind of boundary Langley was willing to cross. When physical models failed to agree on when or how Earth's poles might shift, intelligence officers turned to something far less tangible: human consciousness itself. By 1975, the agency had begun quietly underwriting what it called anomalous perception studies. These projects had multiple code names over the years: Sunstreak, Grill Flame, but most people know them collectively as Project Stargate. The mission: to determine whether trained individuals could acquire information about distant places, hidden objects, or even future events without physical contact. Remote viewing was the technical term. Outwardly, the program targeted military applications, locating hostages, spotting weapons, predicting adversary moves. But internal correspondence, later released through Freedom of Information requests, shows that one stream of research took a stranger direction. A handful of remote viewers repeatedly reported glimpses not of secret bases or enemy labs, but of planetary-scale disturbances, oceans flooding inland, lights in the sky, a sensation of the planet tilting. Debriefers initially dismissed these as symbolic noise. Yet as those images recurred, someone remembered the magnetic studies tucked away in the vaults. In 1977, a decision was made to test a hypothesis few dared to call scientific. Could magnetic anomalies influence psychic perception? To find out, researchers placed viewers in magnetically shielded rooms, then timed sessions with peaks in geomagnetic activity, the moments when solar wind compressed Earth's field. The results were inconsistent but provocative. When the field spiked, reports of vivid imagery increased. Analysts wondered if the human brain, with its own weak electromagnetic patterns, might somehow resonate with geomagnetic flux. If that were true, then perhaps some individuals could sense planetary stress before instruments registered it. Meanwhile, another branch of research was unfolding at the Monroe Institute in Virginia. There, civilian scientists explored altered states of consciousness through audio frequencies, a process they called the Gateway experience. When U.S. Army intelligence learned about it, they saw potential synergy with Stargate. The Gateway protocols aimed to synchronize the brain's hemispheres, supposedly allowing perception beyond linear time or space. A classified Army study from 1983, Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process, later released under the CIA's CREST archive, concluded that consciousness might access information through interdimensional energy motion. Most academics dismissed that language as pseudoscientific metaphysics, but inside closed rooms at Fort Meade, officers treated it as an operational theory waiting for proof. Participants trained under Gateway methods reported sensations eerily similar to the Stargate visions: sudden darkness, immense pressure, glimpses of crustal upheaval. One transcript describes a viewer claiming to see continents sliding under waterlines. Another mentions a flash of magnetic readouts spinning wildly, though the subject had no access to such technical concepts. These reports landed on desks shared by analysts still monitoring magnetic field data. The overlap was too striking to ignore. By the late 197s, the CIA arranged cross-sessions. Psychics were quietly assigned to view global energetic changes. No specific phrasing like pole shift appeared in the tasking sheets, but interview notes reveal questions about planetary stability and field inversion signatures. In multiple sessions, independent viewers described similar patterns: polar zones brightening, electrical storms within the atmosphere, and strange distortions near equatorial regions. Debriefers noted consistency far beyond chance. The scientific branches scrambled to verify anything physical behind those perceptions. Magnetic observatories reported minor jerks and anomalies during several of the viewing dates. Correlation didn't equal causation, but it fed the narrative that human consciousness might indeed pick up geophysical shifts. A research memo summarized it bluntly. Subject correlation with planetary field variation exceeds expectation threshold. Recommend expanded study. Funding quietly increased. By the 1980s, Stargate's operations included physicists from Stanford Research Institute who were told to quantify these psychic impressions against known magnetic oscillations. One test locked a remote viewer in a Faraday cage, an enclosure blocking external electromagnetic signals, and asked her to describe the state of Earth as of now. She drew an image showing the planet enveloped by arcs, labeling them radiance fields broken. The next day, sensors detected a geomagnetic storm triggered by a major solar flare. Statistically coincidental, perhaps, but enough to convince some at Langley that intuition might detect disturbances science hadn't yet modeled. As results filtered upward, so did anxiety. If remote viewers kept sensing catastrophic field disruptions, what if they were glimpsing an event still ahead? Certain reports mention time displacement sessions, experiments where subjects were told to project decades into the future. Within those accounts, dated between 1981 and 1984, recurring descriptions appeared of flooded coastal lines, silent satellites, and a global stillness after the sky flashes. Analysts labeled these esoteric overlays and filed them separately, but they never threw them out. Hidden among bureaucratic stacks, they became psychic echoes of the very pole shift scenarios the agency feared. At the same time, the Gateway experiments strengthened ties between consciousness research and physics. Proponents argued that mind might interface with what they called the planetary resonance grid, a notion paralleling Schumann frequencies, low electromagnetic tones formed between Earth's surface and ionosphere. When those frequencies changed, participants reported dizziness, disrupted sleep, even vivid dreams of displacement or inversion. The Monroe Institute documented these reactions, and summaries quietly reached contractors evaluating geophysical effects on personnel. To psychologists, it was suggestion. To certain strategists, it was premonition. Inside government meetings, debate raged. Skeptics warned that blending psychic data with hard science would destroy credibility. Others countered that in intelligence work, 90% uncertainty still left 10% chance of warning. Use every sensor, one memo read, including the human one. The CIA wasn't claiming psychics could see the future. It claimed they might register cues the instruments missed, patterns hinting at approaching volatility. By 1985, as official enthusiasm waned publicly, classified operations persisted under smaller budgets. Experiments cross-checked psychic outputs with magnetic readings from satellites like MagSat and later Arsted prototypes. When both data sets hinted at accelerated field movement, even skeptics admitted the coincidence was unnerving. Declassified fragments described senior analysts noting non-instrumental concurrence across independent awareness channels. In intelligence language, that meant the psychics and the machines were saying the same thing. Behind the curtain, panic brewed. Several insiders later disclosed that remote viewers started reporting a horizon event, an undefined transformation they felt was inevitable within their lifetime. One viewer wrote cryptically in a notebook, "The poles don't swap slowly, they jump." That phrase circulated quietly among case officers, some of whom linked it back to the terminal displacement terminology in earlier magnetic reports. The connections deepened the unease. If both scientific and psychic data pointed toward sudden magnetic reversal, what timeline were they describing? The internal response shifted from inquiry to contingency. Working groups recommended shielding certain command centers against geomagnetic impulse. Others suggested storing data offline to survive prolonged satellite blackout. Officially, these preparations were justified by solar storm risk, but the wording of internal briefings hinted at broader fears. Somewhere between physics and prophecy, the CIA seemed to believe something large was coming. Yet within a few years, budget scrutiny and public skepticism threatened the program. Congressional reviews demanded proof, not intuition. So in 1995, Project Stargate was formally closed, its documents declassified and shuffled into archives. Most journalists dismissed it as harmless eccentricity, but buried among thousands of pages were still those odd cross-references: geomagnetic displacement, planetary shift, gateway convergence. No one outside the security community ever received a clear answer about how seriously they'd taken those terms. What we do know is that during the program's final phase, at least 2 analysts attempted to correlate remote viewing transcripts with long-term magnetic models. Their internal summary ended with one chilling sentence: "Viewer consensus aligns with accelerated field migration within 50 years." Half a century from the early 199s would place that horizon right where modern scientific forecasts now hover, mid to 1 SD century. When their viewers kept seeing the same event, panic quietly spread. Outside observers called it coincidence. Those within the classified corridors called it convergence. And for the first time, the psychic and the scientific agreed on one disturbing message. The planet's magnetic heart was preparing to turn over once again. The prophecies hidden in the Adam and Eve document. For decades, it sat buried, a manuscript typed in neat, mid-century font, stamped sanitized copy, approved for release. Its title sounded like theology, the Adam and Eve story, but what it described was geological annihilation. The author, John Thomas, was neither obscure nor famous, a trained engineer with a fascination for catastrophic Earth cycles. In 1963, he submitted his work to publishers and, not long after, the CIA quietly classified it. For nearly half a century, the document lay dormant. When it finally appeared in the 2016 CIA digital archives, it stunned researchers who realized why intelligence officers might have hidden it. Thomas's cataclysmic timeline sounded disturbingly like an operations forecast. The book's central assertion was simple but terrifying. According to Thomas, Earth's crust doesn't move gently or gradually. It slips, shifting over the mantle in a matter of hours when magnetic and gravitational equilibrium reach a breaking point. Oceans wash across continents, mountain chains fold, and civilization resets in an instant. He called it a recurring event, a cycle of destruction and rebirth, encoded in myth as floods and fires. To the casual reader, it resembled pseudo-history. But inside CIA circles, analysts noticed eerie overlaps between Thomas's narrative and classified geomagnetic data the agency was already collecting. His title metaphor, Adam and Eve, wasn't religious. It referred to survivors who repopulate the world after each global reset. That language sounded esoteric, yet to a national security mind obsessed with continuity of government, it hinted at the ultimate survival planning scenario. Internal memos later declassified show that the document was copied into the agency's scientific intelligence archives under restricted circulation. Marginalia in one surviving copy include handwritten notes referencing magnetic field collapse, rotational inversion vectors, and shelter trajectories. The handwriting style matched other internal analysts' annotations from the mid-196s. Proof that the manuscript became an active discussion point, not merely a curiosity. Analysts treated it as a speculative model rather than a story, parsing each chapter for testable elements. They cross-referenced Thomas's claim that sudden polar instability would begin with accelerating magnetic drift, exactly what observatories had begun recording. One line underlined 3 times reads, "Every reversal of magnetic polarity coincides with a reshaping of the crust." That sentence, taken alone, could explain why the agency viewed the text as more than fiction. Meanwhile, within the parapsychology division running Project Stargate, remote viewers described nearly identical imagery: continental displacement, atmospheric distortion, and the death of compass direction. Those parallels ignited heated internal arguments. To the physicists, this was absurd coincidence. To political analysts, it was early verification from separate sources. Official debate divided the agency into 2 camps. One framed the Adam and Eve story as myth dressed as science, unworthy of classified study. The other contended that myths often preserved memory of cyclical natural disasters, which might align with magnetic reversals seen in geological strata. A 1967 assessment memo concluded that historical memory expressed through religious narrative may preserve analog record of past displacements, effectively endorsing further analysis. That was bureaucratic understatement for, keep looking, it might be real. Thomas wasn't the first to theorize crustal slippage. Charles Hapgood's earlier work, The Earth's Shifting Crust, proposed similar mechanisms, famously receiving a letter of encouragement from Albert Einstein near the end of his life. What made Thomas's version alarming was its precision. He gave timelines, rough intervals of about 6,500 years between catastrophic resets, and described geographic outcomes, the North Pole relocating to Hudson Bay, tropical zones freezing overnight. Those numbers and coordinates later mirrored entries redacted from CIA magnetic projection models. When the agency compared his predicted intervals to paleomagnetic reversal records, correlations appeared, not perfect, but close enough to justify classification. One study team even modeled Thomas's mechanism against hydrodynamic equations, discovering that if ice mass at the poles suddenly redistributed, crustal displacement could occur much faster than earlier theories allowed. The problem wasn't plausibility anymore, it was probability. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the document quietly informed continuity of government exercises. Emergency planning conferences included extreme geophysical disruption scenarios, listed without explanation. Insiders recall a separate binder circulating under the codename Cycle Doctrine. Within it were projections derived from Thomas's estimates paired with recent magnetic readings. It treated the pole shift not as folklore, but as a classified horizon event requiring preparation at infrastructure level. When investigators decades later studied the CIA-released version, they found that entire sections were missing. Black bars covering paragraphs titled Sequence of Events and Survival Map. Those omissions created more speculation than clarity. What exactly needed redaction in a 190 SAXS speculative manuscript? Words like Atlantic Surge Corridor, reversal latitude, and impact duration appear partially visible between the blocks, suggesting geographic coordination data. To outsiders, this secrecy only cemented the document's mythic stature. Online researchers began circulating unverified complete versions reconstructed from secondary sources, claiming to restore the censored sections. The CIA never confirmed authenticity, but persistent rumor held that the full text included estimated displacement timelines extending into the 21st century. Even if fictional, that detail eerily resonated with magnetic acceleration data modern satellites later confirmed. Within Langley, analysts sought external corroboration from geologists under private contract. Reports from ice core studies in Greenland and sediment cores in the Pacific revealed abrupt temperature spikes aligned with rapid geomagnetic shifts thousands of years ago. Though mainstream geologists still debated mechanisms, intelligence summaries condensed it to one chilling takeaway: quick global reconfigurations were possible. The connection between that conclusion and the Adam and Eve story tightened when debrief sheets from remote viewing experiments described similar sequences: instantaneous crust motion following magnetic collapse. Several analysts began calling this overlap pattern replication across domains. The phrase appears in redacted 1982 CIA memos filed under Environmental Stability Division. It meant that both esoteric and empirical channels pointed to identical end states. The secrecy surrounding the document's removal from public circulation lasted more than 30 years. When asked during later Freedom of Information inquiries why such a manuscript had been classified at all, agency representatives offered only procedural explanations: administrative inclusion in archival categorization. But multiple former intelligence historians confirmed privately that the book was restricted to prevent unnecessary anthropogenic anxiety. Translated, the public didn't need to panic over something officials couldn't control. By the late 1990s, fragments of the original text began circulating unofficially. Independent researchers noticed that Thomas's speculative cycle clock pointed to increased magnetic instability beginning in the early 21st century. Around the same period, satellite measurements indeed documented polar drift accelerating fivefold. Correlation reignited internal debate. Had the crazy engineer been right after all? Inside classified sessions, analysts revisited old notes. The once dismissed phrase, terminal displacement of fields, first seen in CIA geomagnetic reports, reappeared cross-referenced to Thomas's terminology, terminal oscillation of shells. Whether coincidence or codified borrowing, it indicated conceptual lineage. Someone had adopted his language into scientific modeling. As digital declassification widened in the 201s, journalists pouring through the CIA's CREST database stumbled upon sanitized versions of both the Adam and Eve story and companion correspondence dated the same week. In the margins of one memo was an almost casual scribble: reassess 204 window. That tiny note became internet wildfire. Researchers connected it to other declassified documents, including Project Looking Glass rumors suggesting convergence dates within the same time frame. The result was a feedback loop between history and conspiracy, A once fringe narrative legitimized every time the CIA redacted it again. Even mainstream outlets acknowledged the oddity. Why classify a speculative book for half a century unless someone found its claims uncomfortably plausible? Inside modern intelligence culture, the story is still whispered as a cautionary footnote. Evidence shows that while many dismissed Thomas's apocalypse as pseudoscience, others quietly based emergency design criteria on it. Bunker geometries, data preserves, and relocation protocols started aligning suspiciously with the geographic realignments he described. When the document finally became publicly accessible, it arrived missing not only pages but metadata, original accession numbers replaced by new catalog codes. Tracing those codes led researchers to broader CIA programs on environmental contingency operations. The implication: the manuscript wasn't hidden because it was fanciful. It was hidden because it fit too neatly into classified planning already underway. And that's what unsettled investigators most. A work blending prophecy and physics had shaped real policy, even as officials ridiculed it publicly. Meanwhile, remote viewers, geophysicists, and intelligence analysts all converged independently on a similar forecast. The planet's magnetic architecture was heading toward instability within decades. Within Langley's walls, they started calling the predicted turnover simply the cycle. It wasn't a religious notion anymore, it was a timetable. One internal summary concluded: probability of axial displacement within modern civilization's endurance horizon cannot be dismissed. In bureaucratic language, that was as close to belief as an agency could put in writing. So, while the public never heard of the Adam and Eve story until the internet age, its echoes were built into contingency infrastructure decades before. What began as one man's speculative apocalypse manuscript became a classified lens through which the CIA measured its own survival odds. Meanwhile, other divisions, especially those experimenting with timeline projection, started using Thomas's dates as calibration points. They called it synchronization testing. Others might call it prophecy-turned-protocol. Behind the sealed doors of intelligence basements, belief and science had fused into a single operational doctrine. And that's why, as researchers now read the sanitized pages line by line, the question isn't whether the story was true. It's whether someone inside already decided it was. Project Looking Glass and timeline discrepancies. It began as a rumor buried in late-night message boards, something about a black-budget project built to see through time. But unlike most myths, this one left paper trails. Scattered across Defense Department contracting records from the late 198s are vague line items citing temporal field analysis and quantum resonance simulation. When investigators later compared those titles to declassified energy research papers, overlaps appeared. Theoretical groundwork for space-time resonance was real. Physicists at national laboratories had been modeling it for years, which gives weight to the idea that a classified program might have taken the leap from theory to machinery. Inside the intelligence community, the codename most often whispered was Project Looking Glass. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, fragments suggested emerged during a joint initiative between the CIA and certain defense advanced research units seeking predictive modeling tools. The logic was straightforward. If global catastrophes followed cycles, then maybe cycles could be forecast the way weather is. But the methodology was anything but conventional. Sources who later claimed involvement described massive ring-shaped containment structures built in secure Nevada facilities, not far from where electromagnetic pulse experiments already occurred. They supposedly generated controlled torsion fields, rotating magnetic curls designed to distort space-time metrics at microscopic scale. Data from these tests were fed into computers running predictive algorithms extrapolated from chaos theory. The objective? To simulate branching world lines under varying magnetic conditions, essentially testing how environmental tweaks today might ripple into tomorrow's planetary stability. For years, the rumors stayed fringe. Then in the 2000s, leaked interview transcripts attributed to former defense contractors included terminology almost identical to language found in CIA environmental monitoring memos. Phrases like geophysical convergence bands and temporal alignment protocols. That linguistic overlap implied a shared heritage. Whatever Looking Glass really was, its vocabulary matched that of the geomagnetic studies born decades earlier. By the mid-1990s, as Project Stargate wound down, the search for other predictive tools intensified. Within Langley's Directorate of Science and Technology, analysts posed a radical thought experiment. If consciousness experiments indicated awareness could transcend time perception, could technology replicate that effect artificially? The question drew both laughter and funding. It was the height of the information age boom: quantum computing prototypes, digital climate models, neural simulations. Predicting the future no longer sounded mystical. It was an engineering challenge. Contracts formed under the guise of temporal field model integration. Inside secure labs, teams combined geomagnetic data, solar cycle records, and gravitational modeling. The computational engines churned through historical datasets, searching for pattern resonance, a repeating fluctuation connecting magnetic instability to solar maxima and to socioeconomic upheaval. Algorithms began generating timelines dotted with convergence points, years where physical and psychological stress indicators peaked together. One cluster centered on 204 to 205. That same window appeared in older predictive economic studies and in lore whispered by former remote viewers who'd referenced similar decades in their sessions. The coincidence frightened some researchers. Either the system was self-referential, feeding on its own inputs, or multiple avenues of analysis truly pointed to a shared outcome. Whichever the case, within classified circles the assumption took hold that the mid-21st century represented a hinge in world stability. In internal correspondence, the project's engineers referred to their simulations as mirrors. Each mirror represented a sequence of potential events derived from magnetodynamic equations. Hence the later rumor that Looking Glass was literally a device one could look through. In practice, it was banks of linked quantum processors attempting to predict cascading outcomes faster than conventional supercomputers. Reports circulated of operators claiming to witness visual projections created by overlapping probability fields, though skeptics dismissed those as data artifact illusions produced by interference patterns on monitoring screens. Still, the psychological impact on participants was recorded. Engineers reportedly experienced nausea, temporal disorientation, even faint vertigo during calibration runs, symptoms mirroring what early gateway subjects described under hemispheric synchronization. To intelligence overseers, that resemblance between psychic and technical phenomena felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation that consciousness and environment might interface. Through the same magnetic medium, funding increased. Late-decade test logs labeled certain experiments timeline reconciliation exercises. When output variables diverged too far, operators adjusted input parameters until models stabilized around common dates of field inversion. According to one heavily redacted summary, temporal harmonics demonstrate peak coherence between model years 2038-2045. On its surface, that was just simulation jargon. But in intelligence briefings, it became shorthand for predicted crisis years, when environmental, technological, and magnetic systems might reach critical alignment. Whistleblower accounts, decades later, described classified briefings where these convergences were treated as operational deadlines. Underground infrastructure projects, data preservation initiatives, even DNA and seed archive expansions were all justified by continuity criteria, a sterile phrase masking apocalyptic expectation. Officials didn't say when the poles would flip. They merely ensured that if civilization blinked, government would open its eyes first. Skeptics inside the program argued the models were corrupted by feedback bias, researchers unconsciously tuning data to match earlier CIA cataclysm theories. The computers, they said, weren't predicting anything. They were echoing the fears encoded in their own inputs. But attempts to debunk the anomalies failed when independent physics teams under unrelated contracts noticed identical magnetic and orbital harmonics emerging from pure math. Science seemed to be catching up again. The Looking Glass archives grew. Each simulation run produced gigabytes of spatio-temporal variance maps, colored renderings of potential Earth magnetic configurations plotted over centuries. Analysts found clusters dense around two particular epochs, one corresponding roughly to 12,000 years ago, matching archaeological evidence of abrupt climate upheaval, the other around the current century. That duality convinced many participants they'd indeed captured the cyclical fingerprint of the planet, the same pattern the Adam and Eve story and earlier psychics had warned about. One internal memo, never intended for public eyes, summarized it chillingly. Temporal models and extrasensory projections converge on identical phase intervals. Recommend interdivisional coordination for continuity planning under cycle hypothesis. The author's name remains blacked out, but the wording left no doubt that, to some, the machine's predictions validated the paranormal. Outside the vaults, the project's whispers escaped through innocuous channels, budget requests citing quantum environmental forecasting, politicians approving funds without suspecting what they supported. By the early 200s, references to legacy temporal infrastructure surfaced in continuity of government literature. They described hardened data bunkers calibrated to specific geomagnetic latitudes, implying prepositioning for anticipated field distortion. When journalists later unearthed fragments of those documents, officials denied any knowledge of time-related research, attributing terminology to environmental simulation. Yet beneath the official wording, the numbers tell a story. Every forecast dataset stretches to mid-century, tapering abruptly around 205, as if the model stops computing beyond that point. Whether from technical limits or deliberate omission, the result feels ominously final. Interviews with retired systems engineers shed personal light on the process. One recalled, "We weren't building a time machine, we were building a warning clock." He claimed the output graphs began looping, returning similar futures no matter how variables changed. "The program just ended there," he said, as though that's where equations stopped being solvable. His testimony aligns with declassified DOE notes referencing non-stable end states in long-term geomagnetic projection. In layman's terms, the model predicted chaos, mathematically complete unpredictability, beyond a certain date range. Inside the intelligence ecosystem, this paradox created a dilemma. If the future past a certain point is unknowable, strategy shifts from prevention to survival. And that's precisely how planning evolved. Defense archives from early 21st century years show corresponding upticks in procurement of subterranean command structures, radiation-shielded memory banks, and off-grid communication links, all justified as routine modernization. The pattern mirrors historical moments where civilizations stockpiled for eclipses they couldn't explain. As for the project's fate, official silence reigns. The CIA's released indexes mention archived temporal datasets under administrative records ending in 1998. Some researchers think the work migrated entirely into private defense industries, hidden among predictive analytics ventures. Others suspect integration into planetary monitoring satellites able to track magnetic flux in real time. A quieter, continuous version of Looking Glass peering downward instead of forward. What's certain is that beyond myth and rumor, fragments of authentic documentation exist. And they all whisper the same uncomfortable detail. Somewhere within overlapping equations of magnetism and time, multiple methods, psychic, mechanical, mathematical, arrived at one decade, one cluster of years, when everything converges. Around 204 to 205, the mirrors all agreed reality itself bends. Once they believed they had a date, the question became who gets to survive. From that moment forward, secrecy shifted from inquiry to insurance. The era of fascination was over, the era of preparation had begun. Building for the end, the underground network. By the mid-1990s, the fear had shifted from if to when. With Project Looking Glass producing converging dates and psychic programs echoing the same warnings, the agency's obsession turned physical. Plans began surfacing under dry, bureaucratic names, continuity of government, deep shelter initiatives, infrastructure resilience. But those who authored them knew what they were building toward. Survival architecture. Across the United States, construction crews labored under contracts that looked ordinary at first glance. Communications bunkers, seismic research labs, secure archives. Yet many of those sites corresponded directly with magnetic stability zones identified in classified geomagnetic models. Engineers weren't just hardening facilities against warfare. They were positioning them against the planet itself. The most notorious examples surfaced through whispers from defense contractors. Beneath the Colorado Rockies, in the granite heart near Cheyenne Mountain, older missile command complexes were retrofitted, upgraded with magnetic shielding far stronger than nuclear specifications required. In Nebraska and under Mount Weather in Virginia, new tunnels appeared in geological surveys, carved into low-conductivity rock to deflect magnetic induction. Officially, these were to ensure communication survivability during geomagnetic events. Unofficially, they were continuity shelters. Funding flowed from discretionary accounts labeled civil defense modernization. After the Cold War's end, few questioned expenditures framed as national security. But budgets told stories words couldn't. Operating costs for subterranean facilities doubled between 1998 and 2004, even as above-ground commands closed. Something underground was expanding. Whistleblower engineers later described design details uncharacteristic of simple command bunkers. There were vaults meant for biological storage, entire libraries laser-etched into quartz memory crystals, and self-sustaining habitats equipped with hydroponic arrays calibrated for decades of autonomy. Each complex had climate systems tuned to counter electromagnetic surges, essentially, to ride out a planetary blackout. Some of the most revealing clues came not from American soil, but abroad. Norway's Svalbard Global Seed Vault opened in 2008, celebrated publicly as a genetic insurance policy against climate change. Yet satellite imagery shows deep, magnetically shielded foundations beneath it, over-engineering for a simple freezer. The vault's location rests just outside predicted high radiation latitudes in classified CIA geomagnetic models. Coincidence, maybe, but the same alignment appears at a handful of secret NATO facilities scattered across northern Europe. Meanwhile, civilian agencies quietly echoed the pattern. Around 2001, the U.S. Geological Survey began relocating sensitive instruments from coastal zones inland. NASA's data backups moved to hardened servers in the Rockies. The reasoning was resilience, yet memos referred to preparing for severe field fluctuation scenarios, terminology borrowed straight from intelligence vocabularies decades old. The warp between routine planning and quiet survivalism widened each year. Inside the intelligence community, new departments emerged under vague titles: Strategic Continuity Directorate, Resource Preservation Program. Beneath them hid sprawling logistical charts mapping population triage estimates, energy microgrids, and vital knowledge repositories. One chilling entry simply read, Population Vector .03, Sustainment Priority. Translation: 3% of the population designated for guaranteed continuity under national emergency. The number matched Cold War estimates for elite survival quotas. Scientific insiders faced impossible choices. Many geomagnetists contracted under classified terms confessed decades later that non-disclosure agreements stretched beyond death. Researchers from observatories in Canada and Antarctica recalled being summoned for briefings that began with technical discussions but veered into moral territory: what information to release, who to warn, and who to leave uninformed. The stated justification was stability. Public panic could kill faster than magnetic chaos. Still, silence waited. Heavy. One retired physicist from a defense lab hinted that his team modeled induced current patterns through continental power grids, simulating how massive field shifts could fry transformers worldwide. We were told it was solar storm preparedness, he said, but the parameters assumed something larger: planetary rotation offset. When asked why power infrastructure and not population evacuation drew focus, his answer was simple: logistics. You can't move everyone underground. You only move the critical systems and the people running them. As networks expanded, secrecy paradoxically bred evidence. Every new complex left procurement trails, ventilation orders, bulk steel shipments, specialized magnetic shielding contracts. Civilian oversight began noticing anomalies. Purchase patterns that didn't fit any declared public program. An investigative journalist tracing tunneling permits across western states found blueprints marked Special Classification C, a code historically reserved for continuity of government projects. Those requests peaked precisely when Looking Glass models predicted convergence decades ahead. Underground expansion wasn't limited to the United States. Russia revived massive subterranean facilities under the Ural Mountains. China began hollowing out command cities beneath its northern plateaus. Even minor allies joined in, Switzerland reinforcing Cold War shelters, Australia excavating storage silos deep in the outback. The phenomenon was worldwide, each nation citing strategic modernization, while quietly aligning construction latitudes with magnetically stable zones known only to advanced geophysics programs. Publicly, governments sold those projects as protection against terrorism or climate disasters. Privately, insiders used different vocabulary: field reversal resilience. A handful of leaked European Union planning documents from 2013 mention long-duration electromagnetic displacement scenarios. The phrasing was clinical, but the meaning unmistakable. Officialdom had adopted pole shift language without admitting it. Ordinary citizens remained unaware, yet hints surfaced everywhere. Highway signs near known federal compounds quietly changed, redirecting truck access to remote mountain passes. Entire archives, art preservation, seed diversity, digital records, transferred to secure sites labeled Heritage Continuity. Museums digitized everything, while universities partnered with defense agencies to back up research into geostable crystal storage. The message beneath the bureaucracy was clear: prepare for a reset, keep knowledge intact. Those who worked on excavation described surreal strictness. Phones forbidden, GPS disabled to prevent internal mapping, delivery schedules shuffled nightly. Yet mistakes happen. A contractor near Dulce, New Mexico, leaked footage of massive bore machines descending hundreds of meters through basalt. The company that paid him vanished days later, merged into a new entity registered to a known CIA front. Official response dismissed it as conspiracy fodder, yet geological surveys show ground cavities at the coordinates he named. For the handful of civilians attempting to piece fragments together, patterns formed like constellations. Declassified budget sheets aligned with sudden increases in deep rock drilling stock, while psychological operations teams released distracting narratives about alien bases or hollow earth myths. Plausible deniability through ridicule. Behind laughter, construction went on. By mid-2010s, whispers leaked from aerospace contractors involved in designing continuity craft, large suborbital transports capable of relocating key personnel rapidly between hemispheres. Blueprints described ceramic shielding designed not only for re-entry heat, but for electromagnetic resilience. Test flights at remote ranges were explained as aerospace tourism prototypes, though none reached the market. To those tracking funding streams, the correlation between these vehicles and underground network expansion was unmistakable, a closed-loop survival system from sky to stone. Ethically, the paradox gnawed at insiders. Protecting leadership while leaving billions exposed felt indefensible. Some scientists attempted subtle rebellion, publishing sanitized studies hinting at field instability, hoping academic peer review would ring public alarms. Their efforts rarely reached mainstream awareness. Review boards quietly reclassified such papers as sensitive geophysical data. Grant renewals suddenly vanished. Careers ended with non-disclosure settlements, and the world above kept spinning. Meanwhile, within engineering circles maintaining these bunkers, culture began shifting. Jokes about arc assignments circulated, staff filing informal bets over which site would activate first. Contractors nicknamed elevator shafts Jacob's ladders. Beneath humor lurked fatalism. Everyone sensed preparation wasn't for if, but after. And above ground, the subtle proofs multiplied. Railroad lines extending from decommissioned bases reopened at night, hauling prefab concrete segments uprange. Satellite images captured thermal signatures, vast underground cooling systems venting heat into snowy valleys. Each revelation briefly surfaced online before digital takedown notices cited national critical infrastructure. Within hours, the evidence disappeared, yet echoes lingered through mirrored archives and eyewitness blogs. The secrecy once meant to protect began eroding its own credibility. The more governments built underground, the more citizens interpreted every anomaly as confirmation of apocalypse. In trying to save order, they fueled myth. Still, construction continued. Official continuity exercises in 2018 simulated sustained communications blackout from magnetospheric collapse. Participants practiced re-establishing governance with satellite constellations disabled, realistic only if someone expected that scenario. Following year, infrastructure reports cited shielded server repositories, with redundant copper grounding up to a kilometer deep. That's not electromagnetic convenience, that's survival architecture. Every door sealed below the surface became both safeguard and confession, an admission that secrecy had limits, and maybe faith in disclosure had expired. Scientists once whispering warnings within sealed rooms now operated the projects those warnings created. The loop had closed. And despite every classified reassurance that the world would never need these underground cities, entrances kept multiplying. Guarded tunnels in Nevada deserts, Arctic ice shafts descending to stainless corridors, Antarctic domes hiding beneath communications dishes. Each doorway another piece of proof not hidden in files but carved into rock. Because the more they built underground, the more evidence rose above it. Heat traces, procurement trails, power lines leading nowhere. Every vent, every tunnel mouth, every sealed convoy whispered the same unspoken admission. They're already preparing for the end. Signs in plain sight. For those paying attention, the warnings were never really hidden. They were painted on airport runways, embedded in navigation updates, flickering through satellite corrections. By the late 200s, the magnetic North Pole had sprinted across the Arctic from Canada toward Russia faster than at any time in recorded history, nearly 60 kilometers a year. That acceleration forced aviation authorities to update runway numbers that no longer matched compass bearings. Pilots flying to Tampa, Fairbanks, and even far-flung Arctic bases suddenly required new charts. Officially, it was routine maintenance. Unofficially, it was the planet's compass losing patience. Meteorologists noticed their instruments drifting out of alignment too. The World Magnetic Model, a joint project of the US and UK, normally updated every 5 years, but in 2019 scientists rushed out an emergency revision. The Earth's magnetic field had shifted so rapidly that GPS devices and navigation systems, depending on magnetic offsets, risked serious error. Somewhere in that bureaucratic scramble, you could trace whispers of quiet panic. The very systems guiding aircraft and satellites were sliding out of sync with the planet beneath them. Oceanographers saw complementary changes. Atlantic current measurements showed subtle but measurable deviations in speed and temperature gradients. The North Atlantic Oscillation, a driver of weather patterns, acted unpredictably. Some linked these anomalies to climate change, others to standard variation. But a few physicists quietly pointed out correlations between those oscillations and fluctuations in field strength. When magnetism falters, the atmosphere breathes differently. Charged particles move where they shouldn't. Auroral activity told its own story. Lights that once framed polar skies began stretching further south, appearing over Germany, Colorado, even France. People treated them as rare beauty. To scientists, they were evidence of magnetospheric weakness, charged solar wind penetrating deeper through thinning shields. The Earth's defenses, invisible but vital, were growing inconsistent. Meanwhile, satellites began misbehaving. The Swarm mission, Europe's trio of geomagnetic observatories orbiting Earth, reported sharp local distortions around the South Atlantic anomaly, a region where magnetic intensity dips dangerously low. Radiation there already damages electronics and exposes astronauts to elevated doses. Year by year, that weakened pocket expanded. Engineers inserting new equipment into orbit had to plan evasive maneuvers around invisible magnetic riptides. Down on the ground, strange coincidences multiplied. Migratory animals, whales beaching in record numbers, birds veering miles off seasonal routes, were documented worldwide. Biologists proposed pollution or sonar interference. Yet historical studies showed that species navigation depends partly on magnetoreception, tiny crystals of magnetite in their brains guiding them across continents. When the field wanders, their internal compasses falter. Evolution built them to trust the magnetic map. Nobody taught them the map could move. Civilian researchers monitoring magnetometer stations noticed the drift's acceleration. In laboratories across Scandinavia and Canada, amateurs began pooling data, uploading field readings into open databases ignored for years. Their graphs mirrored declassified CIA fragments, though few realized the overlap. Discussion forums filled with speculation. Was the shift simply natural, or the prelude to a flip? Those conversations, once fringe, began echoing mainstream reports as journalists picked up anomalies they could verify. The realignment of aviation charts, the rewriting of global navigation system algorithms. Then came the digital archaeology. Between 2016 and 2002, the CIA's CREST database released millions of pages of declassified materials. Most people hunted for UFO secrets or Cold War espionage. A handful skimmed through dull-sounding sections labeled geophysical studies. Buried there were sanitized paragraphs mentioning magnetic displacement monitoring and terminal field behavior. Redactions covered coordinates and dates, but the surviving phrases resembled modern research vocabulary. For independent investigators, it was validation. The intelligence world had measured the same instability long before the public conversation caught up. Online transparency became its own accelerant. Every declassification wave bred new theories, some wild, others alarmingly consistent. Researchers linked ancient catastrophe myths to magnetism cycles, tracing similarities with the once classified Adam and Eve document. Academic geophysicists mocked the connections, yet behind jokes many quietly confirmed that the field's current decay rate exceeded long-term averages. Regardless of myth or math, decline was real. Governments maintained calm press releases. NASA emphasized that partial reversals occurred, before without extinction. The European Space Agency described field variations as manageable. Yet in internal risk reports, later leaked, they acknowledged increasing uncertainty windows for satellite survivability. Radiation shielding projects tripled in funding. There was no broadcasted panic, only a global tightening of safeguards. Across developing nations, infrastructure failures coincided with geomagnetic troughs. Power grids in South America faltered during solar storms. Navigation buoys in the Indian Ocean drifted miles from position after magnetic recalibration errors. Each incident carried a mundane explanation, but patterns whispered otherwise. Behind technical jargon, humanity's magnetic dependence stood naked. Civilian media occasionally brushed the edge of the story. Articles about runway renumbering or compass anomalies would trend briefly before fading. Readers shrugged, science worked, things adjusted. What most missed was scale. Magnetic north sprint had doubled again by 2021, tracing directly towards Siberia. For the first time, modelers couldn't predict where it would stop. Among the few who obsessed over long-term data, dread grew. Amateur observatories compared government field graphs with redacted CIA records released decades earlier. The trendlines aligned almost perfectly. It was as though the current moment had already been simulated long ago. Internet sleuths whispered that the emergency update to the world magnetic model corresponded exactly with forecast intervals mentioned in those past documents. Whether coincidence or confirmation, faith in official transparency eroded further. Meanwhile, subtle social cues hinted that agencies knew more. Major telecom corporations moved backup data centers into mountain regions far from magnetic minima. Airline companies updated autopilot firmware to rely less on magnetic north and more on inertial reference systems. Tech giants opened remote storage hubs in magnetically quiet zones. None of these decisions came with grand announcements, yet all mapped neatly onto the same global contour maps intelligence once kept secret. Even climate behavior started echoing old catastrophist scripts, jet streams shifting unpredictably, localized cold bursts amid record heat. While meteorologists pinned causes to greenhouse forcing, independent analysts linked anomalies to interplay between upper atmosphere charges and weakening magnetic boundaries. If the poles were indeed migrating toward replacement, these deviations were early tremors, invisible earthquakes in the planet's electromagnetic skin. Public science walked a careful line. Acknowledging radical possibility means admitting ignorance, and few institutions risk that. So press conferences spoke of field complexity, multi-decadal variability, never collapse. But in technical literature, phrases like rapid secular variation and possible dipole decay replaced older calmness. Jargon aside, it meant scientists were nervous. In online communities, fragments of declassified images spread, black-barred pages showing curves labeled projection termination. The same phrase appeared decades apart in unrelated documents. Some concluded the agencies were still tracking an internal countdown. Others believed the redactions hid nothing more sinister than outdated math. Yet absence of clarity became its own evidence. By the early 202s, whispers coalesced into conferences. Independent physicists, military veterans, and digital analysts convened privately to cross-reference open data with released intelligence files. Many emerged convinced the gradual magnetic drift masked an approaching nonlinear surge, a point beyond which correction models fail. Some cited the 204 to 205 convergence range repeatedly reappearing in historical projections. Still, mainstream outlets maintained composure, warning viewers against conspiracy. Because officially the world had decades, even centuries, before any full reversal. But censors told a quieter truth. Hotspots of rapid fluctuation spreading like bruises across the magnetic map, stronger auroras, satellite drag anomalies, and compasses inching restlessly. The Earth's heartbeat was quickening. So while politicians debated climate accords and scientists debated terminology, the signs kept accumulating in silent precision. Runway numbers changing, satellites twitching, control rooms recalibrating. Each small act of correction formed a mosaic of global unease. What few recognized is that these adjustments, these subtle recalibrations, were not symptoms of control. They were admissions of loss. A planet whose magnetic north strides faster each year is a planet announcing transition. And those declassified fragments hint that long before the rest of us noticed, someone in an agency basement already counted the steps. Because the real evidence of impending change isn't hidden in secret vaults or black-barred memos. It's out there in plain sight, stitched into daily operations, printed on Runway asphalt, encoded in GPS updates. The quiet proof that the world's magnetic skeleton is shifting beneath our feet, exactly as the old files warned. What the redactions reveal. When the first set of declassified documents hit the CIA's CREST database, researchers expected the usual Cold War monotony. Transaction forms, cables, technical logs. What they found instead were pages littered with black bars that looked almost deliberate, like a message written through omission. The headings were routine: geophysical correlation study, environmental stability directive, temporal field collation. But the words missing under them, coordinates, durations, proper nouns, formed a pattern stranger than what survived. At first glance, it read like bureaucratic gibberish. Regional relocation protocol to commence following. Redacted. Maintain operational continuity within. Redacted latitude sector. When investigators charted what little geographic hints remained, they discovered every surviving coordinate sat far from anticipated magnetic minima, zones that passed geomagnetic maps identified as relatively stable. In short, the black bars covered the dangerous places, the volatile lines. Someone had systematically erased the world's weak spots. Digital analysts began quantifying the censorship. They compared multiple copies of the same file, one from an early microfilm release, another from the online archive. The newer versions displayed expanded redactions. That shouldn't happen. Declassification normally removes censorship, not adds more. It suggested internal review after release, an after-the-fact decision to conceal what earlier clerks had missed. Whatever lay hidden wasn't trivial. It required post-publication cleanup. Crowdsourced researchers overlaid unredacted fragments onto modern mapping software. The results lined up with known deep shelter zones: Colorado's Front Range, northern Scandinavia, central Australia. Regional phrases like Zone A Safe Corridor or Altitude Threshold Compliance repeated around those same coordinates. In between, long sections were inked out, most notably those referencing equatorial or coastal sectors. The implication was quiet but unmistakable. The redacted areas corresponded to projected impact zones in the event of magnetic displacement. Former intelligence archivists interviewed off-record described a rigorous internal logic to blacklining. Names hide people, numbers hide capacity, but coordinates hide intentions. Anything revealing operational geography, especially of continuity facilities, was automatically masked. Yet these files weren't military site plans, they were scientific summaries. Why redact topography from magnetic charts unless location itself had strategic weight? One document in particular stood apart. Its title, Terminal Field Behavior Consolidation Report, 1989, appeared across multiple internal indexes, but exists publicly only as a cover sheet followed by 23 untouched pages of black ink. Even page numbers vanish in the middle, replaced by blank brackets, as if the information itself bent out of reference. Pattern analysts zoomed into the texture of scanning noise and discerned faint outlines of tables under the blackout. Pixel by pixel, they estimated that each missing entry contained coordinate pairs, likely degrees of latitude and longitude. When plotted statistically, they formed a ring cutting through the mid-latitudes, exactly where magnetic modeling predicts the transitional equator would migrate during a pole reversal. If true, the CIA hadn't just discussed possible geographic effects. It had mapped survival arcs and then hidden them. Linguistic examination offered further clues. Phrases repeatedly censored included relocation node, transfer vector, and zone normalization. Wherever those three appeared together, the following paragraphs vanished. Analysts dubbed them trigger trios, shorthand for sections identifying where and how human or data relocation would occur during field failure. In the few instances those terms slipped past censors, surrounding text hinted at prepositioned resource depots and administrative clusters scattered along high-altitude plateaus. It wasn't apocalypse fantasy, it was logistics. Another curious find emerged when comparing interagency correspondence. Memos sent from CIA technical divisions to FEMA and NOAA staff contained attachments labeled cycle contingency graphs. Only the title survived declassification. Still, referencing memos acknowledged receipt and noted disagreement about public-facing probability communication. Translation: emergency agencies debated how much to tell civilians. NOAA wanted clarity to fund research grants. CIA lobbied for quiet to preserve order. The compromise, evidently, was silence. Some historians argue the blackout served simpler motives, protecting unverified science from public misinterpretation. Yet an archived routing slip from 1991 belies that. It orders that all materials referencing survivor zoning remain within restricted energy environment compartment. That phrase doesn't describe speculative theory, it describes operational planning. The word survivor alone drags the discussion from pure science into contingency governance. What's more, the density of redaction increased proportionally with time proximity. Early documents from the 190 SXS show scattered obfuscation. By the 198s, entire paragraphs disappear. By the 199s, pages vanish. Correlation implies that as the agency grew more certain, or more nervous, secrecy deepened. If early research wondered whether, later research planned for when. A handful of decrypted metadata notes revealed authorship patterns. Some of the most heavily redacted sections trace back to units previously linked with Project Stargate and environmental intelligence programs. It's as though psychic data and hard physics were merged into a single archive, then sanitized together. Recurrent file codes, ESD12, SD29, appear on both remote viewing transcripts and geomagnetic memos. That cross-reference suggests administrative overlap. The same office handling magnetic drift also curated cosmic perception studies. Among declassified correspondence, one surviving sentence stands out. Field behavior forecasts align with non-instrumental awareness observations. Everything after that line is blacked out through 3 pages. The wording alone confirms an internal admission that psychic results mirrored physical measurement. Exactly the correlation skeptics dismissed. Removing the explicit examples may have been less about hiding location and more about hiding agreement. Independent coders developed probabilistic models to reconstruct missing strings. Least likely lines restored by frequency analysis spelled fragments such as 203 to 205 operations phase transition. Even if coincidence, it fits the timeline convergence already seen across other programs. Critics call it apophenia, seeing connections in noise, but redaction itself invites pattern seeking. The very act of concealment generates interpretation. Not all suppression came from fear of leaks. Some insiders suggested internal moral debate. A retired systems analyst recalled a meeting in which 2 divisions argued over disclosure. One side pushed total transparency, claiming humanity deserved warning. The other insisted that foreknowledge would crumble global economy and social order. According to his recollection, the latter prevailed. "We can't save everyone," his supervisor allegedly said, "but we can prevent worldwide suicide." No transcript confirms the quote, but cultural hints remain. Phrases like minimized civil destabilization, scattered through sanitized after-action reports. By the late 201s, as digital declassification accelerated, curiosity turned forensic. Analysts began tracking patterns of missing data across entire releases, treating the redactions as negative photographs of truth. They found consistency. Coordinates near continental shelves gone. Time markers crossing into mid-century gone. Technical appendices measuring flux intensity gone. What remained were bland cover letters thanking reviewers for feedback. The skeleton stayed, the organs vanished. Every censorship mark had geometry. When overlaid geographically, the absences traced long belts, corridors across central continents, arcs skirting oceans. One map compiled by independent researchers displayed 3 untouched regions: the High Rockies, parts of East Africa, and scattered Antarctic plateaus. Whether by coincidence or deliberation, those match known bedrock areas where magnetic variance is lowest. The redactions, in effect, drew a negative relief map of potential refuge. Even within agencies, cracks appeared. NASA consultants privately complained that missing CIA data crippled their own global field reconstructions. One internal email chain, later leaked, contained the blunt line, "Langley holds the remainder." That admission validated decades of suspicion that civilian science worked with partial vision, parceled knowledge by design. The pattern of omission reached absurd subtlety. In one 1987 report, every mention of duration was removed. No timescales, no intervals, just blank measure units. Without knowing how fast the field was modeled to change, no outsider could assess severity. This deliberate stripping of time references turned a clear threat analysis into safe abstraction. For researchers frustrated by blackouts, irony cut deep. The more the agency attempted to hide, the louder speculation grew. Every redaction became a marketing poster for dreaded truth. Forums lit up comparing document layers, claiming to detect faint bleed-through words underneath. Some found none, others saw ghosts. Impact Arc, Phase 4, South Atlantic breach. Even false readings reinforced conviction that something catastrophic sat behind the bars. Credible or not, the psychological impact mattered as much as factual. Content. The idea that an intelligence agency might be editing planetary survival data, even out of caution, signaled profound mistrust between public and state. In academic circles, conferences quietly debated new ethics of secrecy. What knowledge justifies silence? Benedictions from the Cold War, containment, deterrence, sounded archaic beside planetary uncertainty. Within later FOIA disclosures, one internal memo offered a rare moment of candor before its own redaction began halfway down the page. Full disclosure at this juncture would generate uncontrollable migration tendencies, resource hoarding, and short-term governance collapse. Accordingly, then nothing. That single visible clause reveals motive plain as day, secrecy as stability strategy. And yet, in trying to preserve calm, the agency may have guaranteed the opposite. Each blackout, each unexplained omission, became fuel for distrust. By censoring the fine print of survival, they wrote the mythology of apocalypse. In the end, the black bars say more than the text ever could. They outline where evidence once lived, what places, what dates, what warnings were deemed too volatile for daylight. To anyone tracing them, the message is almost poetic. Truth can't be erased, only inverted, like a magnet flipping polarity. For every line the CIA redacted, another line appeared in public speculation, mirroring it with equal force. And still one question hangs: how close are we to the tipping point? The science catches up. For decades, the story belonged to rumor and redaction, psychics sketching continents underwater, secret agencies whispering about magnetic collapse. But eventually the empirical world caught up. The data stopped behaving politely. Around the late 200s, what once passed for conspiracy began appearing in peer-reviewed journals, cloaked in cautious language. Rapid secular variation, dipole decay acceleration. Translation: Earth's magnetic field was weakening faster than expected. At observatories stretching from Canada's Arctic to Namibia, magnetometers captured constant drift. The poles weren't just meandering, they were sprinting. The overall dipole strength, the measure of how strongly the magnetic field envelopes the planet, had fallen roughly 10% in less than 2 centuries. Scientists knew reversals had happened before, roughly every few 100,000 years. But this rate of decline hinted the timeline could be compressing. NASA entered the conversation quietly. In internal briefings leaked through partner agencies, analysts warned that satellite constellations, GPS, communication relays, weather trackers, were increasingly vulnerable to radiation each time the field wavered. Solar storms that once grazed upper orbit now triggered temporary blackouts. European Space Agency scientists confirmed it during the 202s with their swarm satellites, mapping an expanding weak zone over South America and the southern Atlantic. That region, decades earlier only a curiosity, had grown large enough to threaten low-orbit spacecraft. Behind careful phrasing, the concern was concrete. If that anomaly widened, satellites could fail in clusters. Engineers began reinforcing hardware, designing autonomous recovery routines in case guidance systems lost orientation. A quiet global race emerged, not for weapons or resources, but for magnetically resilient technology. Meanwhile, geophysical models improved. Using supercomputers, researchers reconstructed 100,000 years of field behavior from lava flows and seafloor sediments. The findings reframed assumptions. Reversals didn't always unfold over millennia. Some ancient flipovers occurred within human-scale periods, perhaps just a few centuries, even decades. During those intervals, the field weakened, fragmented into multiple poles, then recoalesced reversed. Radiation exposure rose, climates shifted, species migrated or died. Catastrophe wasn't instant, but it was measurable. Paleomagnetists examining volcanic rocks from Iceland and Chile found magnetic directions frozen mid-chaos. Evidence that fluxes could happen 50 times faster than textbooks once claimed. One paper summarized dryly, "Geomagnetic transitions express nonlinear dynamics not yet understood." In ordinary speech, that meant unpredictability had returned to the planet's core. What nobody argued anymore was motion. Magnetic North's path across the Arctic was plotted like the heartbeat of a restless world, crossing meridians yearly. Computer models projecting its future diverged wildly, some sending it into Siberia within decades, others splitting it entirely. No model promised stability. Those who had mocked talk of reversal began couching their assurances carefully. NOAA spokespeople stressed that polarity flips don't equal apocalypse, yet conceded they could cripple 21 SD century systems dependent on electromagnetic shielding. In academic halls, the private mood was darker. Specialists compared notes about unusual oscillations, short bursts of directional stall followed by renewed acceleration, mirroring the geomagnetic jerks first seen in the 190 SIXS. Pattern recognition suggested a threshold approaching, an internal tipping event. Scientists debated causes. Some blamed convection interactions in the outer core. Others suspected coupling between mantle and core accelerated by mass redistribution from melting ice. None could explain the unsteady rhythm. The data refused tidy narrative. Every explanation seemed to circle an invisible driver. Curiously, those timelines echoed the same numerical windows that once haunted CIA reports and looking glass simulations, mid-century convergence. Unaware of those archives, modern modelers produced identical estimates. A 2022 Nature article outlining predicted dipole collapse trends projected potential epochal transition within 1,000 years, but flagged statistical outliers as soon as 100, predicting unstable intervals into the 2040s. In curve analysis, that lower end corresponded precisely to the 204s. Scientists dismissed it as probability tale, but tales sometimes wag reality. Across agencies, preparations shifted from theoretical to practical. The European Space Agency initiated the Magnetospheric Shielding Initiative, funding research into satellite constellations capable of real-time regional mapping of field fluctuations. The U.S. Air Force invested in magneto-inertial navigation for aircraft, ensuring flight paths stay reliable should compasses fail. Those decisions weren't fear, they were prudence behaving like prophecy. Climate scientists, too, began noticing secondary correlations. Between 2014 and 2022, the South Atlantic anomaly coincided with subtle ozone inconsistencies and atmospheric ionization spikes. Some researchers posited that weakened magnetic defense allowed more cosmic rays to alter chemical layers, nudging climate patterns. Small effects, yes, but cumulative ones. The same interplay could hasten polar melting, feeding back into the core through redistributed pressure. Feedback from surface to center, a planetary echo. And through it all, the cultural memory of secrecy lingered. Online archivists paired modern measurements with declassified CIA graphs found under headings like magnetic displacement monitoring. The shapes matched too well for coincidence. The suspicion grew that modern science was verifying predictions intelligence agencies had buried decades prior. Yet among scientists, caution remained sacred. They avoided conspiracy language, speaking instead of geomagnetic complexity. But complexity or not, evidence mounted. Pole drift patterns aligning with increased aurora, orbiting instruments inside radiation zones, migratory chaos extending across hemispheres. Each new dataset felt less like discovery and more like confession. Geophysicist Jonathan Mound at Leeds described it succinctly during a 2023 seminar. We are living inside the reversal process, whatever its duration. To a generation raised under satellites and stable orientation, that meant the ground beneath their assumptions was literally rotating into uncertainty. The deeper they dug, the older the warning grew. Sediment cores from the Lost Champ excursion, an event roughly 42,000 years ago when the field temporarily flipped, showed increased ultraviolet radiation exposure, slight genetic bottlenecks, global weather disruption. Hunter-gatherers might have watched auroras in equatorial skies. Modern humans, dependent on electronics, could face invisible chaos far beyond beauty. Suddenly, the once-mocked cataclysm cycle seemed less ridiculous. Across Earth sciences, the taboo softened. Conferences hosted sessions titled Rapid Field Transitions, attended by defense observers taking quiet notes. Space agencies coordinated contingency drills, simulating week-long satellite outages. The line between scholarly investigation and operational defense blurred again, exactly as it had during the Cold War's secret geomagnetic studies. Ironically, this scientific awakening still stopped short of public truth. Press releases reassured, no evidence of imminent flip. But in technical addenda few read, warnings accumulated about supply chain vulnerability, navigation recalibration schedules, transformer hardening. The language of calm disguised budgets of panic. Behind the bureaucratic tone sat human awe. Understanding that the planet's magnetic heartbeat could falter in our lifetime redefined fragility. It shrank civilization's confidence to scale. We built towers of code and metal on a foundation whose compass might rewire overnight. And in lecture halls, magnetists repeated the same hypnotic phrase that appeared long ago in CIA memos now gathering dust online: terminal displacement of fields. It no longer sounded conspiratorial. It was graduate-level shorthand for an accelerating process now measurable, undeniable. So as satellites track the drift hour by hour and laboratories chase equations through molten chaos, one realization unites the real and the rumored. Whatever the CIA once feared, modern science now measures. The veil of secrecy is gone, but the unknown hasn't shrunk. It simply stepped into the spotlight. Graph by graph, decade by decade, data caught up with myth until they were indistinguishable. The prophecy Langley hid within black bars has returned as peer-reviewed fact, wearing the calm vocabulary of science. The planet is changing its mind, and for the first time, we can watch the compass wobble in real time. Countdown to the flip. By the early 2030s, the story had split into two worlds, the official one repeating that field fluctuations are normal, and the quiet one where engineers, scientists, and intelligence analysts compared notes and realized the variables were lining up too neatly. The data convergence predicted decades earlier, those curious 204 to 205 clusters, was no longer theoretical. Magnetometers across the globe hummed in escalating rhythm. The countdown wasn't on paper anymore. It was humming beneath every circuit on Earth. Inside aerospace control rooms, technicians watched satellites drift milliseconds off schedule, then struggle to reorient. At first, adjustments worked. Then, tiny navigation errors began linking across networks, each fix nudging another system out of alignment. You could almost feel the planet's invisible architecture loosening. When European scientists announced in 2034 that local compass deviation at the pole had doubled within 5 years, the admission barely made news. The world had grown numb to chaotic headlines. But deep underground, in those fortified continuity sites once disguised as data centers, the tone was different. Internal alerts labeled magnetic proximity events triggered lockdown drills. Equipment calibrated to detect electromagnetic surges began pinging irregularly, like seismic tremors in an invisible dimension. Engineers called them magquakes. Officially, this was routine calibration. Unofficially, it meant the field was fragmenting faster than models allowed. Meanwhile, governments hosted international panels about technological resilience. Publicly, they debated cybersecurity. Privately, they discussed whether polar drift could suddenly accelerate into cascade. Emergency meetings between NASA, ESA, and the U.S. Geological Survey introduced new terminologies: field partitioning, hemispheric decoupling. They all meant the same thing: unpredictability. As 2038 approached, commercial communications networks began introducing magneto-resistant switches and fiber-based timing systems to bypass compass inputs. Every upgrade claimed efficiency as motive, but documents quietly referenced sustainment under extreme geomagnetic stress. The language read like prophecy disguised as policy. In universities, researchers stopped laughing at past paranoia. Graduate students quoted declassified CIA reports once dismissed as pseudoscience. The phrase terminal displacement of fields entered standard glossaries again, stripped of conspiracy tone. It meant the point at which magnetic lines detach from stable alignment, the beginning of reconfiguration. No one could say if that would take decades or months, but certain simulations showed acceleration forming a near-vertical curve around mid-century. Media attention remained cautious. Science journalists framed the issue as curiosity. Will compasses one day point south? But behind the calm headlines, insurers recalculated satellite risk indexes, global positioning firms drafted contingency plans, and grain trade organizations quietly invested in inertial backup tracking. It was preparation disguised as modernization. By 204, Auroras were no longer confined to the poles. They danced over Brazil, Morocco, and occasionally equatorial skies. Tourists uploaded stunning images, unbothered by what they signified. The magnetosphere thinning so much that solar particles now poured farther into human territory. Airlines shortened high-latitude routes to avoid radiation spikes. The adjustments seemed small, just logistical shifts. but each one moved civilization slightly away from denial. In the same years, whispers about cycle protocols resurfaced online. Anonymous documents attributed to retired intelligence officers described population allocation plans and deep grid activation sequences. Fact-checkers dismissed them as speculative, yet corroborating details, bunker coordinates, terminologies like zone synchrony, matched known continuity files. Maybe hoaxes, maybe leaks. Either way, they rekindled an old fear that survival had been pre-selected decades ago. Scientifically, proof accumulated faster than reassurance. Temperatures fluctuated in strange geographic symmetry. Ocean currents bent unpredictably. Even animal migration paths began inverting. Biologists called it climate adaptation. Physicists quietly pointed to magnetics. And as all patterns converged toward the mid-century threshold, communication between civilian and military observatories tightened into closed channels. The closer the planet drifted to its theoretical tipping point, the quieter official voices became. Around 2043, swarm successor satellites reported fractional reversals, pockets where local polarity flipped completely before snapping back. Newspapers buried the discovery on page 10. But within scientific networks, it was code red. The Earth wasn't simply wobbling, it was experimenting. 2 years later, coordinated sensors detected simultaneous anomalies across 4 continents, brief compass inversions lasting minutes. Air traffic navigation momentarily glitched, forcing reroutes. The phenomenon was labeled localized magnetic eddies, but insiders recognized pattern onset. The cycle had entered stage 0. Confidence in long-term stability fell below 20%. Yet public statements remained placid, promising steady monitoring. In classified briefs, another term reappeared: phase termination. The same phrase once hidden under redactions now described projected thresholds near 2047. Analysts projected cascading navigation blackouts within 2 decades unless reversal slowed, an outcome no model predicted. Within laboratories, scientists pushed for unprecedented real-time core imaging, desperate to confirm what intuition already screamed. The system was breaking symmetry. Meanwhile, human life went on. Cities buzzed, markets expanded, people charted digital constellations above a planet losing its own compass. Few realized that each GPS recalibration notice, each updated navigation protocol, was another tick on an invisible clock started generations earlier inside CIA file rooms. By 2048, synchronized auroras lit both hemispheres for days, record solar calm contrasting against atmospheric riot. Observatories logged intensity blooms consistent with near-field inversion. Communications faltered again, briefly but globally. For perhaps the first time, every nation glimpsed the same sky pulse. Governments blamed solar weather. But quietly, emergency continuity networks came online. Underground facilities, dormant for decades, received encrypted activation signals labeled Cycle Verification Alpha. No global announcement followed. Life continued. Yet deep below, secured rooms filled with quiet applause. The systems worked, the shelters sealed, the data archives spun up autonomously. The hidden network humanity built to outlast catastrophe had finally acknowledged it was time. Above ground, nothing outwardly changed. But compasses trembled minutely, like hands uncertain of direction. Magnetometer traces around the world began synchronizing into chaotic resonance. The long countdown had reached its lower digits. No one could say exactly what the flip would look like, sudden or gradual, violent or invisible. But every pattern in history suggested transformation, not extinction. Civilizations before us endured lesser excursions, though none carried satellites or power grids. Whether by design or doom, the human species had already migrated mentally underground, long before the poles followed. And somewhere, in the old archives marked terminal displacement of fields, perhaps a line predicted even this moment. The steady blink of data screens counting down in silence as humanity watched its magnetic heart prepare to turn over once more. If knowledge is survival, secrecy becomes extinction. What we choose to know, somewhere beneath the noise of satellites and servers, beneath the layers of secrecy wrapped around 50 years of warnings, the quiet question remains. What do we do with what we know? Knowledge once locked inside vaults now flickers across open databases, yet the silence feels heavier than ever. The magnetic field hasn't flipped completely, at least not yet, but the truth has already inverted. Institutions sworn to inform us have built their safety in omission, and in doing so, they turned secrecy itself into the final hazard. For generations, the world's most guarded agencies measured the Earth's pulse and decided the public couldn't handle the rhythm. Maybe they were right. Panic is contagious, survival planning exclusive. But hiding inevitability never made it vanish. When magnetic drift forced scientists to update models in real time, we glimpsed the cost of restraint. Each appearance of calm delayed preparation, each reassurance postponed adaptation. In trying to spare chaos, the system ensured paralysis. The deeper irony is that every prophecy buried beneath redaction lines now sounds like an ordinary lab report. What once read as apocalypse is simply physics under deadline. And those CIA terms, terminal displacement of fields, cycle protocol, no longer belong to rumor. They're part of open scientific vocabulary, stripped of mystique, wrapped in caution. The future they feared is no longer secret. It's scheduled, tracked by satellites, mapped in real time, approached one magnetic heartbeat at a time. Yet history suggests choice survives even inside inevitability. Every era invents its myths to face the unknown: floods, fires, resets. We inherited those stories believing they described the past. Maybe they were warnings for repetition. The pole will shift whether we're ready or not, but civilization's reaction, panic or preparation, remains unwritten. Transparency might no longer prevent the event, but it can prevent betrayal. Imagine if the resources poured into concealment had gone into resilience, global shielding grids, redundant communication lines, education instead of exclusion. The same fear that silenced truth could have fueled unity. But fear hoarded always feeds division. Somewhere in those vaults, the last unredacted line of an internal memo supposedly read, "Ignorance ensures compliance." That sentence might have preserved order once. It won't preserve life. Because no technology, no bunker, no algorithm can replace collective awareness. The magnetic field is shifting beneath everyone equally, and pretending ignorance is control only magnifies fragility. When governments hoarded knowledge, they fractured the very cooperation needed for survival. The real countdown isn't on the magnetometers. It's in whether secrecy finally collapses before the field does. Even now, intelligence agencies maintain plausible deniability while preparing continuity networks few outside will ever see. Maybe that was inevitable too, power seeking refuge before truth. But time has a way of balancing its own equations. Every hidden archive eventually surfaces. Every black bar fades in digital light. And when those last pages show what others chose for us, we'll measure who we were, not by what we discovered, but by what we withheld. Secrecy might have been designed to save us. Instead, it's become humanity's most dangerous weapon, the only force capable of turning knowledge into extinction. If you're still watching, stay curious. Seek the documents they forgot to re-redact, the data ignored because it frightened its authors. Watch what governments build quietly, and notice what they rename maintenance. Because the bigger story isn't whether the poles will flip, it's how we'll act when the compass of authority finally does. For more investigations into the suppressed truth of our cosmic environment, stay with this channel. Subscribe, share what you learn, and look for the next report connecting these cycles to the evidence hidden above our atmosphere. The files aren't finished, and neither is the story.